Hi, I'm Rick, Chief Experience Officer at YOONO. Today is another video in our How to Hire Well series. I'm going to be joined by James, our Chief Legal Officer, where we'll be talking about bias, ethically, operationally, how it appears in the recruitment process. Okay, let's get into it. I'm joined today by James, our Chief Legal Officer here at YOONO. Hand over to James to do a bit of an introduction.
Yeah, hi Rick, good to be here. I'm very happy to be talking to you today. So yeah, I'm the Chief Legal Officer at YOONO. I'm an expert in various areas of law, but in particular, data protection, privacy, digital regulation, and also the law surrounding hiring, which is of course what we're here to talk about today.
So in this episode, we'll be covering why gut feel is no longer enough. Also, why reducing bias is now more than just, again, something that needs to be concerned about day-to-day practices. It's why it's a legal obligation. So it'd be great to get your views and opinions and give everybody a bit more context.
Yeah, no, looking forward to it. So I think, when we talk about the topic of bias in hiring, there are sort of strict legal obligations that employers need to be aware of. Probably most relevantly under the Equality Act, where employers have an obligation to ensure that they are not taking decisions that discriminate against candidates on the basis of protected characteristics, which are things like race, age, sexuality, gender, etc. And so, it's not just sufficient for companies to not take discriminatory decisions, but there's actually a positive obligation there for businesses to take steps to prevent people unwittingly taking those discriminatory decisions.
Yeah.
Because I think one of the difficulties, as we know, is that discrimination can be both conscious and unconscious, and so even employers that have the best intentions, if they've not taken some of those positive steps, they could still unwittingly be ending up taking discriminatory decisions, which then have potentially severe legal consequences.
Yeah, so we hear a lot about unconscious bias. How does that almost materialize itself in a hiring context?
Yeah, so I think the difficulty is that, as hiring managers, we all bring our own subjective experiences to bear on the hiring process. And, we have our own preferences, our own prejudices almost based on our experiences, our backgrounds, etc. And exactly as you say, even without intending to, even if we, attempt to be fair and objective or think of ourselves as fair and objective, those experiences that we have will to some extent necessarily shape how we handle the recruitment process. And that's something you can never, that sort of unconscious bias risk is something that I don't think you can ever completely eliminate, and certainly the law is not asking you to completely eliminate it, but it is asking you to take reasonable steps to try and reduce the risk of biased decisions being made, including those that result from unconscious bias. And so I think, a couple of ways that companies can approach that and mitigate that risk, would be providing training, as lots of businesses already do, to employees, so that they can just be aware of this concept of unconscious bias, and then that acts as a bit of a check in their mind, so that they can have that check as they're going through the recruitment process, and potentially challenge any bias that might be emerging. And then I think the other part of it is about trying to give hiring managers as much information as possible so that they can see the fully rounded candidate, and not just the information about the candidate that they might naturally focus on, but they get to see that sort of 360 view, the full candidate, so that they're armed with as much information as possible, because that information then gives you the best view of the candidate and best equips you, to make a decision that is fair, and to weigh up all of the competing pros and cons between a group of candidates.
I think it's easy as well, right, for companies to sometimes have the best intentions at heart when it comes to implementing these processes, but sometimes those good intentions can sometimes be counterintuitive to having, I guess, an unbiased process.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so that's why I think, again, we'd sort of reiterate that those good intentions aren't enough. You need to have something a bit more robust in terms of policies, processes, training for your staff around what a fair hiring process looks like. How to handle a candidate's personal information fairly, what questions you should or shouldn't be asking a candidate. Making a recruitment process as objective as possible, so having sort of clear criteria for what you're assessing the candidate against, a clear and consistent scoring mechanism that you use to sort of grade candidates against those criteria, so that you are sort of comparing with apples, if you like, and you can sort of look fairly across a bench of candidates and know that you've considered the same criteria and scored them against those criteria consistently. And if you do that, that's an excellent way of demonstrating that it was an objective and fair process and not one that was tainted by bias. But obviously, to do all of that, it does involve some upfront investment in the recruitment process, in the training of the personnel, in documenting through policies the correct way to run a recruitment process, and then actually taking some steps to check that people are following through on that in
not just
practice.
a case of turning up and hoping that you're unbiased in that process, right?
No, exactly. Yeah, it's not a case of just winging it. But I think most responsible employers understand that, and I think they are always looking for better processes, improved tools, new ways of getting complete and accurate information about a candidate that can then be fed into a clearly structured and consistent assessment process. And yeah, I mean, I think that's ultimately what all responsible employers want.
Yeah, nice. So, like, there's obviously legal processes in place, like the Equality Act, that really like evangelize and give direction for what businesses should be doing in this space. And but employers actually have to actively promote equality, not just avoid discrimination. So actually be more proactive. Like, what does that look like?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think we've sort of already made this point, but it's important to underline it that they are positive obligations, right? So you have to have measures in place that reduce the risk of discriminatory decisions being taken, biased decisions being taken. And in practice, that can be a range of things. So we've already talked about the importance of training. We've talked about the importance of having a fair, objective, clearly structured assessment process with clear criteria, etc. I think also one we've not mentioned so far is being really careful about how you advertise the vacancy, what goes into a job specification. So using very objective, factual language, but also language that doesn't sort of imply that the job would suit someone with a certain protected characteristic over another. So, this is a job that would really only be suitable for a young person, or this is a job where actually, we would rather have a woman. And you wouldn't say that, directly in the advertisement, but if you use certain terms or you're not careful with your language, you can create an implication that
It's easy
that's what
to
you're doing.
imply, like, again, subjectively, without intention.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and so you may inadvertently imply that, as I say, what you're actually looking for here is a woman or a young person or whatever. So being careful with that language you use in advertisements is another point that is sort of important in complying with those obligations under the Equality Act.
Yeah, which in essence, a lot of companies talk about making sure that they've got the right culture for their business. And when you're talking about culture fit and the sort of people that you want to bring in, like, some of the challenges there become a bit of a blurred line, right? Around, like, how do you make sure that you're bringing the right people into the business, but it's also not discriminating against other people. I think it's a tricky one that probably is a common place that people try and navigate.
No, that's a really great point, and it's a really important one because it's like important that people don't misunderstand this and don't think that um, just because of this importance of not taking discriminatory decisions based on protected characteristics, that doesn't stop you from looking for someone that has the right cultural fit for your organization. Or
Yeah.
I mean, every business has a particular culture that it's developed over time, that it's invested in, and it's absolutely fine to want to hire people that you think are going to be a good fit for your company. It's just that you can't make that determination on the basis of one of those protected characteristics that we mentioned earlier, and nor should you need to. But it can absolutely be about someone's personality. It could be about sort of someone's specific attributes, how they like to work, what they bring to the workplace, what they prioritize at work. All of those things are sort of fair game. But again, when you're assessing those things, it needs to be against clearly defined criteria. So, for example, if you were looking for a salesperson, it's absolutely fine to sort of look for a certain type of personality.
Sure.
Someone that is perhaps sort of outgoing, that has good interpersonal skills, that can communicate with confidence to a client. So it's fine to sort of look for that personality type, if you like.
Yeah.
But then you have to be clear when you're advertising the job and in the specification, that is what you're looking for, so that there's no implication that it was just based on the fact that the hiring manager just liked that person better, or even worse, that hiring manager chose the person who was
just wants someone to come in and be one of the lads.
Or was like was more like them, or whatever.
And that is like a known trait as well. Like it's very easy for people to think that the right person to hire is somebody that matches their own stereotype and characteristics.
Yeah, which is why like another measure that we've not mentioned so far, but can be helpful in sort of reducing risk, is to have multiple people involved in the recruitment process, right? So you should, just as sort of good practice, you should never really, if at all possible, have a hiring process where there is a single decision maker or a single person involved in that process, because exactly because of that point you've just made, that as soon as you introduce another person or a panel of people into the process, then you're diluting the risk that actually the hiring manager's just going to pick someone that's most like them.
Cool, that's great. So at YOONO, we talk a lot about shaping intent through semantics. So a big part of what we do is diving deeper than just the CV and surface level when it comes to hiring. And I think especially with the level of tooling and almost capability that's at the hands of the everyday person to really craft a CV, which can almost be picture perfect every single time nowadays. Like, what's the advantage in the current hiring environment to dig in deeper than just going surface level from a CV perspective?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. And, as I mentioned earlier, one of the key things here is about equipping hiring managers with as much information as possible. And, the more information you have about the candidate, at least in theory, the fairer that decision can be, because you can take into account, all relevant information. And again, as long as what you're doing with that information is, mapping it back to a clearly defined set of criteria for the job, and obviously also, inviting the candidate to share, their own perspective on that information. So, you know, you might surface something about a previous role that the candidate has, that suggests that they have particular expertise in this area, and but then always inviting the candidate to give their view on that and to sort of supplement the information that you've collected to to check that it's accurate and it's sort of borne out by what the candidate's actually telling you. So that's really important. But and I think as well, you're right in terms of particularly actually with advances like we've had with generative AI, it's very easy for a candidate to, go to ChatGPT and get it to write a CV that sort of, as you say, looks pitch perfect and also incidentally maybe looks identical to
here's my CV,
10 other CVs that
here's
you've
the
got.
job description, tailor it, there you go, and everybody's look the same, right?
Yeah, exactly. So actually the utility and value of a CV by itself is really diminishing, I think, because of that. And certainly, I hear anecdotally from companies that as soon as they advertise a vacancy, they're just being bombarded with these sort of artificially produced applications. So you do absolutely need to get beyond that very surface level veneer and find out more about a candidate. And the first step is capturing that information. But then the next important step is what you do with that information, how you validate it, and the weight that you put on that information, which will depend ultimately on how relevant that information is to the criteria that you've set for the job.
And it's not to try and catch anybody out, right? It can work both ways. I think one of the main things that we've seen as almost like a describing word for almost the diminishing returns from a CV, but also then the benefit of our product is based a lot around authenticity. Like as a CV and its role almost becomes more generic, like the desire for adding a human element and authenticity to the process and how somebody can be perceived as part of the hiring process becomes more and more prevalent.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, another legal change that we've not spoken about so far, but it might sort of be interesting to bring up here is the government's also reforming employment laws. And long story short, they're basically going to give employees more rights earlier on, sort of from day zero of employment, rather than having to wait 2 years into employment, which is the case for most rights currently. So what that does as well is it obviously raises the stakes in terms of how significant that hiring decision is, because once you have decided to hire a candidate, day one, they get all of these rights that they don't currently have under existing employment laws. And so, that absolutely means that it's an even more significant decision, and you need to see that 360 view of the candidate and who they are, and not just the CV that they can serve up that they got ChatGPT to write for.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, from a business point of view, like you're instantly being exposed to greater financial and reputational risk. Like it's I think it's going to be a cause for change in a lot of this industry.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. So one other thing that I think it'd be good to touch on would be when we're talking about specific sectors that people are applying for, and then almost like some of the legal ramifications of working in those sectors, like how does I guess tailoring background checks for those individual sectors, say whether it's finance or healthcare or areas where you might need a greater level of due diligence, like how does tailoring the process for individual sectors almost improve fairness in the process?
Yeah, no, it's a great point, and I'm sure a lot of people will be aware of this, but in certain regulated sectors, there is an enhanced level of due diligence that's required, basically on candidates. So, for example, in the financial services sector, you have this idea of a fit and proper person test for someone to be able to perform certain regulated roles in a bank or whatever. And so, what that means is actually there's a regulatory obligation, a legal obligation to understand a bit more about the candidate. And this is a really tricky question of, are they someone, not just are they someone that, technically that can do the job and has the right technical experience, but actually, are they someone who is reliable, trustworthy? So that sort of probity question, and ultimately, like we said earlier, a good cultural fit for an organization within this sector. And so, for those sorts of roles in those sorts of sectors, it's not just that you're justified to do more due diligence, you sort of have to do more due diligence, and the right level of information to gather about a candidate will necessarily be more than it might be in an unregulated sector. And it also cuts across other ways. So it's not just about, regulated sectors versus non-regulated sectors. It's also about obviously the role within the organization, how senior that role is, whether that role has access to money within the organization. Is it a financial role that has an element of trust associated with it as well? So there are all of these factors that sort of bring to bear on the ultimate decision about what is the right recruitment process for this role, what's the right level of information, and how deep do we need to dive, given the type of role that we're hiring for. And so that's why I think, again, responsible employers understand that they don't have one size fits all recruitment processes. They tailor it based on the role, and they are looking for tooling that can be sort of configurable in that way, and can sort of help them adjust, scope up, scope down based on what it is they're looking for, and the role in question.
So not all bias is inherently bad. You see businesses opting to hire people from specific backgrounds, underrepresented areas, and giving chance to people, whether that be for changing their careers. Like, you have almost the flip side of that as well, where you have some businesses only hiring from specific institutions. So you've got almost a directive from the business in two separate guises with two different intentions. It's a really interesting point, right? Where like which one of those is almost bias and which one is not bias, when one has good intentions, one it has good intentions for the business, but it's clearly to hire a specific type of person.
Yeah, no, that's right. And I guess, some of that sort of thing used to be referred to as like positive discrimination, which I think is now terminology that people don't like to use. But I mean, it's a fair point that there could be, perfectly valid programs with good intentions that are attempting to look for, as you say, certain underrepresented groups and give them a chance that, historically they may not have had in the same way as their peers. I suppose all I would say there is that the law in that area is complicated, but it doesn't completely prohibit that sort of thing. So you can have clear programs under certain circumstances that operate in that way and allow you to select candidates who come from underrepresented groups, if you like. But it's complicated. It needs to be approached with caution. And I think wherever you do it, and wherever it is lawful to do it, part of the requirement is that you are very clear about what it is you're doing. You're transparent about it. It's clearly advertised as a specific program helping this specific group. These are the criteria to be eligible for the program. And so what you can't do under any circumstances is sort of advertise it as just a normal recruitment process, and then in the background, be taking those decisions, that discriminate against people, for whatever reason. So yeah, it's tricky. And then to your other point about sort of looking for people that have maybe been to quote unquote the right universities, or like have worked at the right places. Again, you need to be really careful with that. It's fine to have as an objective criterion for a job someone that has academic excellence in a particular field, someone that has like demonstrable intelligence or whatever. So it's fine to say that we need someone for this job that is clever or has a good academic background. But then you have to sort of be fair in how you allow people to demonstrate that, and there could be different ways of demonstrating that. And the same with sort of relevant work experience. It's fine to say we want someone with clearly relevant work experience, or even work experience in this particular field, even if that's quite a niche field. But I think what you don't want to be saying is we want people that have worked for just this specific company, because again, there's a risk that if that company is just based is based in this country but they're not in that country, that then you're discriminating against people based on the opportunities they may have had and where they were. And
well, it's almost inherited bias at that point, right?
Yeah.
Nice, cool. So one of the, I guess, elephants in the room, let's say, is when we're talking about AI specifically. So with YOONO, AI is a core part of our tool, and when it comes to AI tooling as part of the recruitment process, um, there's always a challenge and pushback and sometimes objections around, well, it's been proven that AI can already be inherently biased in some situations. Like, how can businesses who are using AI as part of their product make sure that they're almost combating that from a legal perspective?
Yes, I mean, I think for companies that are actually building those AI products that are sort of training AI models, it all comes back to the quality of the data sources that you're using to train the models. And quality here means lots of different things. So partly it means just the sort of the raw accuracy of that data, how up to date it is, what sort of quality control processes have been through to ensure that it's actually correct. But it also means ensuring that the data sets that you use are broad enough and representative enough of the population on which the resulting product is going to be used. So if you're going to use, an AI product to help inform hiring decisions about candidates in the UK, has the underlying model been trained on data sets that are representative of the entire UK population, and not just subsets of that population. And obviously there's a very clear risk that people from minority communities, for example, that make up a smaller proportion of the population, or might be less well represented in data sets for other reasons, that their data is not going to be as representative in the model, and therefore they could be this sort of concept of bias being built into the model because the original data wasn't sufficient to train the model to take accurate decisions about those people, or make accurate recommendations or outputs, or whatever it might be. So for the developer of the model, it's all about the quality of the data sources. And actually the way that the law is going in this respect, it's moving towards requirements for the developers of AI products to be more transparent about how they've trained the models, the data sources they've used, to make that information available to the users of those products, and also to regulators and whoever else. So responsible companies in this space think very hard about how to train the models, and then they also think very hard about testing those models. So once you've found what you think are the right data sets, testing the model, spotting where there are still inaccuracies or there are still things being missed, and then going back and doing the fine tuning, tweaking the model, bringing in additional data sets, and that should be an iterative process. And again, if you're a customer who's looking to buy one of these products, you want as much reassurance as possible from the developer that they have been through those processes, they've documented them, it's been as rigorous as possible, because ultimately that's what you're then relying on as your guarantee, if you like, that the product is going to be fit for purpose, and is going to enable you to take decisions that are fair and lawful.
Okay. Do you see a future where tools like YOONO, where the core focus is to help remove bias, try and standardize the process to some certain extent, become almost the legal standard, as opposed to best practice? Because I guess a lot of the conversations we have around how businesses construct their hiring process, their screening process, it can differ a lot, which in itself can introduce a level of ambiguity and bias just because the process isn't standardized. So
I think that standardization point is really important. And the way I often think about it is this, that ultimately all of this information exists out there, right? It's there, it's out there, for better or for worse. We live in an information society where there is a huge amount of information that's available about people, and so that can sort of go one of two ways. Either you can have a process where you have a very high level hiring process where you're only looking at a CV and you're only doing like a sort of a brief interview with a candidate, and then all of this other information that's out there, either you just miss it, or in my sort of view, the worst case scenario, you sort of have people inconsistently looking at it, or like doing a quick Google, having a look at someone's LinkedIn and sort of half seeing something, or
which all of those sources have their own bias inherent.
And it's just human nature that people are going to want to do that, and so but often that's a very unreliable process, because you'll look at something for a few seconds and you'll catch half of something, but you'll miss the context. So that's one option. Or the alternative is that you sort of accept that all of this information is there, and it's helpful to take that information into account so that you can best understand the candidate. But to try and make that part of a fair and objective recruitment process, that you capture that information and present it to the hiring manager in a consistent and structured way. And so exactly to your point about standardization, so that then again, when you look across a bench of candidates, you are looking at the same sources of information presented in the same format, in the same way. And again, it helps to make it a more objective process, rather than, you Google candidate A and you see something, but then you miss something for candidate B, and you have a look
or it's knocked onto page 2, or
exactly. So I think capturing that information, presenting it in a standardized way, and then all of the points I made earlier about that's not necessarily the end of the process. You'd still want to talk to the candidate. You'd want to invite them to give their perspective on that information. You'd want to test it against other sources, but it all starts with having the raw information. And I don't think we should try and pretend that information doesn't exist, because it does, and people are going to look for it. And so we want to capture it, and we want to present it in a fair, objective, standardized way.
Yeah, it's a really good point about everything being in the public space anyway. And I think, again, we've seen some objections around that, more so from a morality point of view, that naturally, as part of a recruitment process, somebody puts forward the best version of themselves. And as soon as it's not just consuming that, but consuming everything that's there, it almost becomes, from the hiring manager's perspective, a little bit icky, let's say. And the moral issue becomes a point where, well, I don't know whether I should be looking at that. But the reality is everything is there anyway, right? Like you say.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I mean, ultimately, at the end of the day, everyone has the right to a private life, and they have the right to, who they are at work, who they are at home. And as long as the two don't interfere with one another, then, that everyone accepts that that's the way it should be. But yeah, I mean, exactly to your point, the other risk that you have as an employer is that, people can be very artful about the version of themselves they present, and in actually, you want to try and get as full a view of a candidate as possible for all of the reasons we've discussed. And so I think there are all sorts of controls that you can have in place, to try and balance that appropriately. And I think we've been spoken about most of them. Certainly allowing the candidate to give their perspective on things is important, but also what we were talking about earlier in terms of, there's not a one-size-fits-all approach. So the amount of information that you would want to capture on a candidate really does depend on the type of role that you're recruiting for, how senior it is, how responsible it is, how public-facing it is, the sector you're in. All of that informs whether, how deep you need to go into a candidate and who they really are, in order to make a fair and responsible hiring decision. So I think, if, as long as employers are conscious of that, and and also that they use reputable tools that have been properly tested, that use reliable data sources, and that are transparent about the data sources that they use, so you can sort of look at the information and understand where it comes from. Because I think I sort of think about, I think this was like GCSE history where I got to talk about this, but like, when you have to sort of look at how reliable a source is, right?
yeah.
And like,
Yeah, Jesus.
is this, something that comes from, a sort of, it's like a matter of public record. It's on like,
Yeah.
company's house versus is this something that someone's posted on social media?
How many times has it been redacted and relayed and quoted and paraphrased and
because I mean, all information is not equal, right? It's not equally reliable.
that's it.
And so I think you want to use tools that, so obviously that use publicly available information and avoid stuff that people have intentionally wanted to keep as part of their private life. But even then, with that publicly available information, that are really transparent with you about where that information's come from, what the source is, so that you can then make an informed judgment about how relevant is that information, how much do I trust it, all the rest of it.
Nice. Great. That feels like a great place to wrap it up. So, no, really appreciate it, James. Really great to get an oversight. And yeah, thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Rick.
Nice one.